So it turns out that the length of your telomeres predict your true biological age and also the genesis of chronic disease better than anything else. So if you have short telomeres in, say, the cells in your cardiovascular system, you're definitely going to be or already have chronic disease. Short telomeres are associated with pretty much every disease of aging you can imagine, from osteoporosis to Alzheimer's disease to heart disease to cancer. For example, in cancer patients have a high percentage of critically short telomeres. People with cardiovascular disease and congestive heart failure and endothelial dysfunction and plaque, atherosclerosis, etc., all have a high percentage of critically short telomeres. Diabetics have a high percentage of critically short telomeres. So it turns out that probably the best metric for aging is biometric, is telomeres. But the best way of looking at telomeres is not only to get an average, but more importantly, to see the percentage of critically short telomeres, because that sets a true picture of what percentage of your cells are going to be immediately dead or dysfunctional.
Hello friends, it's Mike Mutzel here. Thanks for tuning back in. We are in Portland with my friend Jeff Grimm. We're going to talk all about aging. And this idea, Jeff, we're talking offline, how there's kind of this U-shaped curve between optimal health and vitality and optimal performance and strength and everything. And I think a lot of people are kind of, melding the two, thinking that if they overtrain and do a marathon over the weekend and not get much sleep, that they're really being healthy. But you've been, and we'll talk more about telomeres a little bit, but let's kind of introduce this idea that like vitality and optimal performance are maybe two ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, exactly. And this concept is sometimes called hormesis. So it's sort of this bell-shaped curve. If you stress an organism too much, you've got accelerated aging, disease, and dysfunction. If you understress an organism, which doesn't happen too much in our culture, but theoretically, if you understress an organism, you would also have accelerated aging and dysfunction. One classic example is astronauts, right? So an astronaut in space has no stress on their joints, and they find that they develop things like osteoporosis. Yeah. On the other end of the spectrum, you may have a ultramarathoner, who's overstressing their joints, running well over 100 miles a week, and you're going to see that although exercise is healthy, if you take it to an extreme, it becomes a source of oxidative stress. So that sweet spot for optimal longevity from an aging point of view is probably somewhere in the middle of that bell curve. Mm-hmm. So we might call that, true health optimization or hormesis, that an organism to thrive needs the perfect amount of stress. Some people, this is interesting too, some people have made the argument that if you take too many supplements, you're going to be understressing yourself.
Wow, I never thought of it. It makes a lot of sense.
I heard a lecture a few years ago, and this nutritionist basically saying, hey, no one ever thinks about this, but imagine if you took too many antioxidants. Mm-hmm. Theoretically, your cells kind of, that oxidative stress antioxidant system would kind of go to sleep if you never had any oxidative stress.
Right. Because it's a signaling molecule throughout the body to do adaptive things.
Exactly. So those enzymes might, deregulate and things like that. So this idea of perfectly stressing an organism is really interesting. Mm-hmm.
And so how does this come up in the clinical conversation where people are striving for optimal vitality, optimal health, hormone balance, want to slow down the aging process? Do you have the conversation with people like, that CrossFit training 7 days a week, twice a day, that may not be getting you to where you want to be from a vitality standpoint, unless you want to become a professional CrossFitter or a runner or cyclist, whatever, you may be overdoing it.
Yeah, so that conversation would come up, especially if you're seeing the wear and tear patterns starting. If you're seeing systemic markers of inflammation. Often I think the first thing you're seeing in those types of people you're mentioning is they're wearing and tearing quickly. They're tearing their joints, they're trying to do a rope climb up to the ceiling, and they're 60, 70, 80 years old, and they're going to the gym 4 or 5 hours a day, 6 days a week. I had a patient a few years ago who actually we diagnosed with overtraining syndrome because she was a younger patient, about 30, but we checked her adrenal glands, for example. And we're all worried about high cortisol, et cetera. But if you overtrain, your cortisol system is going to get depleted and exhausted. Mm-hmm. And in fact, she came in with very low levels of cortisol, so that was a sign that her body again was overstressed, and you were starting to see an endocrine pattern of too much stress. So you might see that stress in an endocrine point of view, from an inflammatory point of view, from a joint health point of view.
It's going to manifest somewhere.
It's going to manifest somewhere. So I think the conversation in the clinic happens, if you have an overtraining or somebody overdoing it when you start to see those things manifest.
All right, so let's go back to the adrenal and the cortisol thing, because the paper just came out. It was, I think, endocrinologist in Brazil, right? And so this is a video actually we have Carrie Jones, she's your practitioner, you may know her. It was a year and a half ago, we talked about how adrenal fatigue has really been kind of glossed over, that it's a little bit more complicated with the hypothalamic pituitary kind of regulatory feedback loop. So this 30-year-old woman that you were mentioning that was doing a lot of training, so her output is low. Is it a glandular atrophy issue, or is it a hypothalamic pituitary dysfunction, like a compensatory pattern to tell the adrenals, all right, we're like overdoing it, so we're going to put the pause button and turn the dimmer switch down?
Yeah, and let me speak to that from a couple of points. I heard that lecture and I thought it was interesting. I think, we all kind of oversimplify the work of Dr. James Wilson to some extent, and we say, hey, is your cortisol high or low? And let's all make a diagnosis and call it adrenal fatigue. And if cortisol is high, let's use adaptogens, and if it's low, let's use glandulars or cortisol pharmaceutical pills, right? But you're correct. I think that's somewhat reductionist. And here's an example. Plus, this also speaks to your body being smarter than any of us clinicians. If you have high cortisol, let's say you're truly making excess cortisol because you're under too much stress, it turns out that cortisol is toxic to your brain. Cortisol is absolutely neurotoxic. So imagine your body is smart, right? It sees this high cortisol in your brain. What's it going to do? It's going to stop making ACTH because now you have this toxic cortisol in your brain. So what you might see as, oh my gosh, you have an adrenal glandular issue, might be your body compensating for cortisol-induced neurotoxicity, which that's just putting an interesting spin on it. So again, speaks to the potential complexity of kind of overdiagnosing a simple cortisol test. But I think you're right, and you see this in patients who arrive at a better balanced state. HPA access kind of gets into balance if they're eating well, if they're in normal circadian rhythms. How you get them there is not often as simple as, hey, here, take a supplement that has ashwagandha.
Yeah. Awesome. That's a beautiful point. And so the systematic review that was just published, I think, on Monday or Friday, this is like the 15th here in March, 5 of the 33 or 53 studies that they looked at actually looked at ACTH stimulation. And what they found was that 5 of the 6 showed there was no difference between the burnout group and the control group. So meaning that when the adrenals were told to turn on, they turned on, right? And there was like a 16% reduction in one of the 6 studies, but the other ones were normal. So it speaks to what you're saying. So that's really interesting. So cortisol is neuroexcitotoxic.
Yeah, and more further to the point, think about it this way. What organ, regulates all your other endocrine organs? Mainly it's your brain, right? So your brain sets the tone of these organs. And you're correct. The adrenal glands are not like wiped out. You ACTH somebody who's got chronically low salivary cortisol, it's going to stimulate just fine, probably, because the gland doesn't really like fry out. You don't really get, probably, like you said, adrenal fatigue. But what happens is your brain modulates the output of hormones from that organ in particular states of stress, because again, your brain is setting kind of the master control switches. That's kind of how I would look at it. But I think, to her credit, I started thinking about this a lot more after Carrie Jones and you guys had that talk. And then that research you're citing is fascinating, because we all had this assumption that these people, and we're not sending our patients routinely to endocrinologists, we're doing salivary adrenal testing. So we really don't know what the health of their adrenal gland is. We just know what their level of cortisol is. So fascinating that when you stim test them, the gland kicks into gear.
Yeah, and you said when you ACTH someone, let's define that because not everyone knows what that is.
Adrenal cortico stimulating hormone is produced by the pituitary gland, I believe. And this is the hormone that sends a signal to your adrenals to make cortisol. And that access between the hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal gland is referred to as the HPA axis. So again, that's how these 3 endocrine organs communicate with each other through various feedback mechanisms. If you have really high cortisol, theoretically your brain should not make as much stimulating hormone. The stim test we've been talking about is usually done under the purview of an endocrinologist. They inject you with adrenocortico
Releasing hormone?
Releasing hormone.
He's seen 15 patients today. So anyway.
They inject you with ACTH, and your adrenal glands respond by making cortisol, because ACTH tells your adrenals, hey, make cortisol.
Very interesting. Awesome. All right, so we kind of digressed a little bit from this optimal aging kind of discussion, but what's come up in recent years is this notion of telomeres, and the idea that it's commercially available. I think Spectracell launched like the I don't know what PCR technology back in like 2010, and we're talking now about this flow fish technology that's
Yeah.
much more accurate. But let's talk about the best proxy for longevity, right? So if we want to look at our, like, how is my lifestyle working? Like, am I pushing the needle too much, or do I need to slow down or meditate or whatever? What is that proxy, and then what can we do about it?
Perfect. So our first question in this space, if we're interested in longevity medicine or true anti-aging medicine, we're not talking about aesthetics here or Botox to take your wrinkles away, but the question is, how old am I biologically? Let's think about other ways we might assess that. We might check a woman's bone density. If they have good, strong bones, we might assume that they're aging pretty well. If they have very weak, brittle bones, the opposite. We might look at inflammatory markers in the blood to get a sense of if somebody has elevated interleukins or C-reactive protein that might be stimulating a accelerated trajectory of aging. We might do cognitive tests. We might send somebody to Dr. Amen Clinic, for example, and do a SPECT scan of their brain, or do one of these brain speed tests. Because if your brain is not working fast, again, you might be aging more quickly from a cognitive decline point of view. We might look at vascular health. We might do a calcium score of the heart, or do tests looking at endothelial function to see, hey, what's the health of the blood vessel? That will give us a sense of how you're aging, because your vascular system is this big organ, and if it's not doing well, you're probably accelerating your aging. We might look at body fat or lean muscle mass and try to get a sense of how somebody's doing kind of biologically.
Sure.
We might check their endocrine function, like we've been talking about. We might check their hormones. Hey, you've got a high level of DHEA, therefore you must be doing well. And actually DHEA is a relatively decent proxy of maybe how you're aging, but one test trumps everything else by far, and has tens of thousands of scientific studies correlating this one biometric with true biological age. And that's telomeres. So let's talk about telomeres for a second.
Sure.
Telomeres are basically segments of repeating DNA repeats that are at the end of linear chromosomes. Prior to, the 70s, people thought this was junk at the end of your chromosome. Didn't do anything, it was junk. Let's go back in time. We go back 40, 50 years before that. We had a guy, Dr. Hayflick. Hayflick discovered, and this was well known, that if you grow and divide a cell in a petri dish, at some point after a certain number of cellular divisions, your cell dies. Nobody knew why these cells died. We thought in the 20s and 30s, if you grew a cell in a petri dish, you gave it the right nutrients, you gave it that special sauce, it would grow forever. But all cells in all cell lines died at some point, even if you gave them all the best goodies, right? So they call that the Hayflick limit. No one knew what the Hayflick limit was or why it happened until the 70s, 80s, and 90s, based largely on the research of Dr. Elizabeth Blackburn's team. Eventually, they went on to win a Nobel Prize in 2009, which I'll talk about a little bit.
Sure.
Hayflick limit was found to be related to telomeres, long story short. Think of telomeres this way. You have your DNA double helix. At the end of it, you have your telomeres, very much like your shoelace.
Yeah.
If you saw the movie Cocktail, which is one of my favorite Tom Cruise movies of my generation, he called those Flugelbinders.
Interesting.
So your telomeres are kind of like the Flugelbinders of your DNA. Think about your shoelace. If that plastic covering gets shorter, imagine you cut it with a scissors day by day, it gets short enough, but it's still there a little bit. What happens to your shoelace?
Phrase, yeah.
It frays and de-ravels. That's what happens to your cells as these telomeres get shortened. So every time your cells divide, your telomeres get shorter. This Nobel Prize was awarded to this team because that was part of what they were investigating, but they actually discovered the enzyme that increases the telomere length, and that's called telomerase.
So that's kind of a reparative enzyme that makes it longer and so forth.
Correct. It adds segments to telomeres. So it turns out that the length of your telomeres predict your true biological age and also the genesis of chronic disease better than anything else. So if you have short telomeres in, say, the cells in your cardiovascular system, you're definitely going to be or already have chronic disease. Short telomeres are associated with pretty much every disease of aging you can imagine, from osteoporosis to Alzheimer's disease to heart disease to
Cancer, you mentioned.
cancer. Yeah, actually. So new assays, so you were talking about the SpectraCell test. Technology for assessing telomeres has evolved. So we now, in my practice, we're using the technology that is the same technology the researchers are using in the field. So I know that the way I'm testing it is the same way they're testing it in these tens of thousands of studies that are being conducted. And that is flow fish cytometry. So long story short, this is a very technically savvy way of looking at hundreds of millions of white blood cells in your blood called leukocytes, which live for 4 months, and assessing not only just their average telomere length, but what's critically important is this assay also looks at the percentage of critically short telomeres.
Let's define and talk about that. Yeah, a little bit. I think that's really important.
So gets a little bit nuanced, but it turns out that it's not only the sort of size or length of your telomere that's important, it's the percentage of cells in your body that have very short telomeres is much more predictive of aging than your average telomere length. And that is because, again, the Flugelbinder effect. If these suckers are really short, all of a sudden you've got tens of millions of cells in your body that are about to senesce, that are about to die. And that has huge implications for cancer. For example, in cancer patients have a high percentage of critically short telomeres. People with cardiovascular disease and congestive heart failure and endothelial dysfunction and plaque, atherosclerosis, et cetera, all have a high percentage of critically short telomeres. Diabetics have a high percentage of critically short telomeres. So it turns out that probably the best metric for aging is biometric, is telomeres. But the best way of looking at telomeres is not only to get an average, but more importantly, to see the percentage of critically short telomeres, because that sets a true picture of what percentage of your cells are going to be immediately dead or dysfunctional big time.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So many questions come to mind. The first one, so is aging, cellular aging, a function of the enzyme being low, or that the shortening is happening faster than the enzyme can keep up, or is it a combination of the two?
Yeah, that's a more complex question. I'm not sure I can perfectly answer. I believe it's a combination of the two. The reparative processes are degraded to some extent. I can speak more to things that increase those reparative processes or maybe help with telomerase and telomere length. But yeah, clearly there are factors that are actively causing shortening of the telomeres, and these are all the things you would think they are.
Yeah.
Like, for example, if you sleep 8 hours a night or more, you have longer telomeres. If you eat a Mediterranean diet, turns out you have longer telomeres. If you don't smoke, you have longer telomeres. If you smoke, you have shorter telomeres. Certain drugs reduce the length of your telomeres, but other drugs preserve your telomeres.
Like metformin and that? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, back in the 80s, there was this phrase, smart drugs, and let's take smart drugs into the, 2017 and say, hey, is any of that corroborated in telomere science? Yeah. Wow. Aspirin preserves telomeres. Metformin preserves telomeres. ACE inhibitors like lisinopril preserve telomeres. Angiotensin receptor blockers like losartan preserve telomeres. Statins, like our worst enemy everybody hates, lovastatin or Lipitor, atorvastatin, preserve telomeres.
Wow.
So maybe one of the reasons why people who take Lipitor have less inflammation and do better from a vascular health point of view and actually regress some of their plaque accumulation may have something to do with telomere preservation, because short telomeres is a disaster in cardiovascular disease, for example.
Wow.
What's also interesting, these ACE inhibitors, anti-aging doctors for years have been saying ACE inhibitors are an anti-aging drug, and they say, it's because it helps with AGEs, advanced glycemic end products, and if you take an ACE inhibitor, and this gets kind of technical for folks watching this, but essentially there was these drugs touted as having an anti-aging benefit for a long time, but now we have the telomere science to kind of explain maybe partially why that's happening.
Wow. Yeah, interesting. So someone that we both learned from, Mark Houston, has talked about it for a very long time. And so he'll recommend like a 10 milligram Lovitor, lovastatin, like every other day. Like he termed it like homeopathic dosing for that anti-inflammatory benefit. So what we're saying about the benefits of the statins may be totally independent of their cholesterol reduction.
Maybe, and people have argued that a lot because statins also decrease C-reactive protein and maybe help neutralize inflammatory pathways that contribute to atherosclerosis. There's even some research on how statins affect endothelial progenitor cells and stem cells within your vascular system. Statin drugs may turn on stem cell genesis in your vascular system. There's all kinds of crazy stuff in the literature, but yeah, I think that research is just fascinating, and it goes to the point you can't just judge something and say this is good or this is bad. Health and science are very complicated, And we have the scientists hopefully sort all this stuff out.
Yeah, and that's a really good point about like being so binary and dogmatic about this. And
Yeah.
we tend to get in that rut in naturopathic medicine. I found in natural medicine that all drugs are bad. You need to do everything natural, but there's some good sides to certain medicines, particularly if we're talking about longevity, and lower dosages than are designed to treat disease. So I think it's a really important discussion. I'm glad you talked about that. So let's go back to these chronic disease states: heart disease, cancer, neurologic dysfunction, Alzheimer's. Is it that the telomeres are shortening, then some sort of metabolic pathway is triggered, which induces the disease? Or is it like a byproduct of the disease that the telomeres get short, or do we know?
Cells with short telomeres die faster. When you have a lot of dead cells, your organs that are comprised of lots of cells don't work.
Wow.
So I think that's the fundamental reason, is because you end up with lots of cellular dysfunction, which affects organ health.
Interesting. All right, so we know all the bad stuff. Let's talk about the good stuff. So there's some herbs, botanicals, lifestyle strategies.
Perfect.
And let's just preface this discussion that you've been, serial testing patients for a while. So
Yeah.
you're able to see like, wow, this strategy and this herb and so forth increases telomere length, which is pretty cool.
I tested my first patient for telomeres 5 years ago. And then as people became more interested, especially the last 2 years, we did several more cases. So there's a few people I've had the good fortune of following their telomere length on different interventions. Now, as I mentioned, the leukocytes live for 4 months. So people say, well, when should I test my telomeres? If you're actively applying a lifestyle change or herb or medication or something else to promote telomere length, the soonest you would want to repeat a telomere test is 4 months after the intervention. But we usually say 6 months.
Yeah.
And then some people who are doing just fine, we might check their telomeres once a year. And if they start to degrade, then start applying interventions. Let's talk about herbs first, because probably the best studied herb to increase telomeres, and really the only thing with scientific evidence that actually shows an herb increases telomerase, is a sort of patented product called TA65, which there's pros and cons. This supplement is very expensive. So people who take this spend $300 to $600 a month on this stuff. They take it for a couple of years and then maybe they toggle it over time. This product is made out of astragalus. So a lot of other companies make astragalus extracts and say, hey, this is going to lengthen your telomeres, but there's no science to back it up. But what's interesting about astragalus is if you take 4,000 pounds of astragalus, which is a lot of bulk material. This is a plant that grows in Inner Mongolia. It's a very wild looking plant. In Chinese medicine, the way a plant looks tells you something about its chi or force or what part of the body it acts on. And astragalus is just one of these gnarly ginseng-like herbal plants that just looks like it would be good for you, right? And in Chinese medicine, astragalus is well known for helping your immune system and other things. One of the things we're fighting with aging, incidentally, is immunosenescence, or the aging of your immune system. So they take all this bulk material of astragalus, and there are 2,000 known molecules in the astragalus plant, and they isolate one, which is called cycloestragonol.
Okay.
And then they have some patented process where they make it bioavailable, blah, blah, blah. And they've studied this in human cell lines in vitro and petri dish, and they also have studied this product in human subjects. And in both cases have looked at, hey, if we introduce this molecule, do we get an increase in telomere length? And the answer is yes. So because of that, since they discovered this in around 2002, it was Geron Pharmaceuticals that first discovered this. Now the company that bought the rights to all this stuff is called TA65. Essentially, this has been studied for a while now, but been commercially available since, I think around 2006, 7, 8, something like that. So this is a relatively new type of product. But again, it's cost prohibitive for most people. And a lot of people say, well, can't I just take fish oil and increase my telomeres? And I'll get to that in a second. But if somebody were to ask me, what's the most exciting clinically studied molecule to increase telomeres, it would be this astragalus extract, cycloestragonol.
So it's just a higher percentage of that cycloestragonol.
That's all it is, to my knowledge. So this
Yeah.
is a just pure concentrate of this single active molecule.
Have you seen any feedback with just pure astragalus root in people? Because I know that's used for like immune function and chronic viral. Have you seen any changes clinically in telomere or telomerase activity and whatnot?
Yeah, so I actually can't speak to that. I don't have any patients taking just astragalus extract or decoction, and then we're looking at their telomeres. But Yeah, as you stated, it's sort of well known to be good to, fight infection and help immune system.
Yeah. I mean, I like the idea of isolating the most bioactive part of a plant, but I also don't like the idea because you're like missing out on some of the biochemistry and so forth. So it's like sometimes, in medicine and health, there's too much of a good thing. So I'm just kind of thinking through my head, but obviously you have the data and so does the company to back it up. So
Right.
in this case, we do know that it's probably pretty effective, hey?
Right, and you could say the same thing about resveratrol. You can take 200 milligrams of resveratrol, or you can drink 40 bottles of red wine.
Yeah.
So obviously whole foods are beneficial from a variety of standpoints, but at the same token, to our earlier discussion on, hey, pharmaceuticals aren't necessarily bad, single isolates aren't necessarily bad, especially, like you said, if you have the evidence to back it up. Mm-hmm. But what we are interested in, let's take a step back and say, hey, what in general makes a person healthy and live longer? And how does that relate to telomeres? And what things in general make a person die faster? And it gets into common sense. So I think if you looked at any of your podcasts, pretty much everybody you talk to probably will have highlighted some of these things, not knowing necessarily that they increase telomeres, but it's common sense.
Yeah.
So one thing for sure is that stress affects telomere length. Inadequate sleep affects it. As I mentioned, certain drugs affect it. Smoking definitely affects it. Alcohol consumption definitely affects it. Chronic hypertension shortens your telomeres. So a lot of the things you already know are deleterious to vascular health also shorten telomeres. So what can you do for the average patient who's interested in lengthening or preserving telomeres? The simple step is functional medicine. Apply good old-fashioned naturopathic lifestyle medicine. Sleep 8 hours, stress management, yoga, tai chi. Let me speak to this more interesting point. I think it's kind of fascinating. And I don't know if you've had the chance to interview people talking about meditation research much. You probably have.
A little bit, but yeah, some of the studies I've highlighted on the YouTube channel, but yeah, rock and roll with it.
Meditation is, if I'm going to be excited about one intervention that's free, that has tremendous data on it for preserving longevity, that's easy, that takes 20 minutes a day, that's easier than exercise or eating good, it's going to be meditation. So the studies on meditation and telomeres are now so extent that we have meta-analyses on meditation studies as they relate to telomere length.
It's pretty amazing.
We have 2 of them, I believe, as I last checked the literature. So what that means to people who don't know is that there's been so many studies that you can actually have a review of the studies that have studied meditation and telomeres. There's not just like 3 studies. And what they found is, even 20 minutes a day of mindfulness meditation, and they did exactly what I said, telomere test, had the treatment group, 20 minutes of meditation a day for 4 months, repeat the telomeres, guess what? Telomere extension.
It's amazing.
For a meditation. So let's think about mind body. You got meditation, you got sleep, and stress management kind of plays into that. According to Mark Houston, fish oil may increase telomere length. Lowering homocysteine, incidentally, might increase telomeres. There's some of the drugs we talked about earlier, like aspirin, hypertensive medications, metformin, which is a diabetes medication.
Yeah.
Exercise increases telomere length. So again, it's for
Vitamin D I heard about.
Vitamin D, absolutely. And it's not only just vitamin D, but it's vitamin D in the optimal range increases telomeres. So yeah, all those things are sort of scientifically validated for preserving telomere health. So again, it's the stuff you would kind of expect. And then diet, of course. You eat a lot of colorful, raw, fresh fruit and vegetables, organic out of the ground, life is good.
Yeah. Speaking of diet, we've covered the ketogenic diet quite extensively on the podcast, and there's a lot of interesting epigenetics and DNA stability, what's known as the HDAC, or the histone deacetylase activity induced through the main ketone body, beta-hydroxybutyrate. So have you found anecdotally or in research or clinically, people on a ketogenic diet have better telomere function or not?
That is a fantastic question, and let me kind of curve that into a side conversation.
Yeah.
I would recommend that anybody truly interested in knowing whether or not their health claim or intervention actually helps, and I challenge this to every practitioner watching and scientist, all you need to do is check telomeres before and after. Is a paleo diet good? I don't know, check telomeres before and after. Is a ketogenic diet good for long-term anti-aging? I don't know, check telomeres before and after. Some person on YouTube saying this or that is great for your health. Let's check the telomeres before and after this thing they're talking about. Is a supplement that's promoted to be the greatest thing since Swiss cheese for aging? There's a few I could name, but I won't.
Yeah.
Are they actually good? Well, let's do an intervention and do telomere testing before and after. So that seems to be where this tool could be used to squelch all these claims that are erroneous, but also prop up what might be a good product or good intervention for actually producing longevity.
Yeah, that's right. And it will weed out kind of what works for the guru may not work for you, because the guru's telomeres could be long when they do the butter and the coffee or whatever, for example, right? And it may not work for you. So I really like this idea of individualizing lifestyle therapy to modify what you're doing.
Yeah.
But globally, we know, a meditation is key, stress reduction, sleep, and everything. And for folks, if you want to learn more about that meta-analysis, we did a video last April. So I think that's when it came out. So it was telomere length, I think reduction in NF-kappa B, increase in NRF2. There's a few other free radical mediated processes, but cool meta-analysis. All right, I definitely want to get into Sermorelin and growth hormone and GHRP6, but anything about the telomeres that we kind of forgot to cover? I guess let's talk about logistics, cost, blood draw.
Thank you. So the company that I use for telomere testing that does flow fish cytometry is in Madrid, Spain, and they're called LifeLength. They have partners in the United States, so you can send the patient's blood to, I believe, Florida, and then they will ship it off. Logistically, our patients get their blood drawn on Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday because it has to ship overseas. Cost is approximately $450 for a telomere test, and the turnaround is approximately 3 weeks. Insurance is not covering this test at this time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Before we go into GHRP6 and Sermorelin and all that, we talked about immunosenescence.
Yeah.
And there's this whole notion in research about inflammaging. This idea that we become more inflamed and we age faster due to chronic diseases and whatnot. How does that weave into immunosenescence? Are they similar pathways and ideas?
Yeah, I'm not sure if the inflammation and the senescence, I would assume that they're related. I could speak to it from a sort of telomere point of view. If your immune system cells, like these leukocytes that we're testing in blood, have lots of critically short telomeres, we know that correlates directly to immunosenescence. So interestingly, going back to TA65, this astragalus extract, and I'm not affiliated with them, just so that's clear.
Yeah.
If you give somebody this extract, you resolve certain aspects of immunosenescence. That's what the clinical research has shown. One cell in particular they've looked at is the natural killer cell. Natural killer cell expression went up a statistically significant increase on this supplement, which you kind of expect because we know astragalus helps your immune system. Well, now we have the pathway, But yeah, I can't perfectly answer your question, but yeah, my understanding, having practiced functional medicine for a long time, just to be generalistic about this, is inflammation causes cellular dysfunction and organ system dysfunction. So
it's kind of at the root cause of a lot of downstream processes, yeah.
And it's this thing. There were whispers in the hallway 20 or 30 years ago, we think inflammation is actually the backdrop of all disease. And now the people who were whispering are screaming from the rooftops. And it does seem clear that things that promote not just inflammation, it's chronic inflammation, because we have acute inflammation all the time. I stub my toe, I'm inflamed, but then it resolves. I bang my knee, it's inflamed, then it resolves. But what happens if you have a knee injury and the inflammation doesn't resolve? You get osteoarthritis. What happens if an injury in your endothelial lining of your vascular system doesn't resolve? You get atherosclerotic lesions. What happens if an injury in your brain doesn't resolve? You might get some of these neurodegenerative diseases. So it seems like inflammation, if it's unresolved, leads to cell and organ system dysfunction.
Love it. Yeah, there's a lot of research out of Harvard actually along this what they call smoldering inflammation. So it's low grade. It's not like you stub your toe. It's going to be chronic. It's going to be acute. It's going to be big inflammation. But there's low grade smoldering inflammation that you're referring to, and I like that caveat that you brought up. Chronic. So that's everyone talks about inflammation, but you guys we need that caveat there. It's not a semantical. This is real stuff.
Or they come in the clinic. This happens to me once in a while. Am I inflamed? Can you check my inflammation? And I'm like, okay. And then we check their C-reactive protein or something, it's fine. And they're like, oh, I'm good. But as you well know, there are hundreds of biomarkers for inflammation. And, we might check one or two, but it's sometimes hard to really get a sense of if this smoldering thing is actually there. And if it's there, where is it? I think it would be very cool in the future to have tests that actually, Scud missile, target that stuff. If I could do a test and say, hey, you've got a little pocket of inflammation in this part of your lung, that would be cool.
Totally. Yeah.
But now it's just kind of those markers that come up.
Yeah, beautiful. And so that's where maybe those telomere tests could come in to see, okay, well, we might suspect some inflammation going on, and then how is that translating into accelerating, senescence and inflammaging as we kind of talked about.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I think we tackled that. A lot of people are going to have, this is awesome content, Jeff. People are going to dig this. Okay, so in the anti-aging world, or people that want to slow down the aging process, get rid of wrinkles, and not just aesthetics, but restore hair and everything else, we're talking about Sermorelin, GHRP6, and growth hormone. And we know, is that kind of playing with fire at some levels?
So let me explain a little bit first about peptides and secretagogues.
Sure, good idea.
And then we'll talk about sort of implications of ramping up, say, cellular division in the context of things like cancer and stuff. Yeah. So secretagogues are substances that encourage your, in this case, pituitary gland to secrete growth hormone. Your pituitary gland stores growth hormone. It's just that as we age, the signaling molecules that tell your pituitary to release that growth hormone are dysfunctional for some reason. And that may happen further up the chain, like in your hypothalamus, for example. Those hormones produced by your hypothalamus that tell your pituitary gland to release growth hormone might not be working for whatever reason. Everybody for years thought growth hormone was sort of the holy grail of aging, and we now know it's not even maybe a huge pillar, but it's one of these things that can help with health optimization if the right context or conditions are met. So a lot of people are interested in, well, we know prescribing growth hormone is problematic in the United States. It's one of the most tightly regulated drugs in the United States. So a lot of patients want growth hormone. They assume that if they take it, they're going to live longer. And I'll definitely get to that in a second. Mm-hmm. But we now have interesting ways of sort of coaxing the pituitary gland to release some of its stored growth hormone. And this is through peptides and things like growth hormone releasing hormone. So there's two things that anti-aging doctors are using increasingly to get your pituitary to squirt out more growth hormone, and they work, and they're clinically studied. One is called Sermorelin, which is growth hormone releasing hormone. That's a similar hormone to what your body makes, which tells your pituitary, hey, release growth hormone. The problem is if you tell your pituitary, hey, release growth hormone all the time, you have a feedback inhibition. So your body says, hey, we don't want to do that, so it shuts it down. So that's called feedback inhibition, and that's mediated by another hormone called somatostatin. So somebody discovered how to override that. So they did this by giving growth hormone releasing hormone, just like before, as Sermorelin, but they paired it with this novel peptide, which you know a lot about, which is called a ghrelin. So ghrelins were discovered in the gut. They make you hungry and various things, but ghrelins are produced in your brain and they turn out to block this feedback hormone called somatostatin. So if you give ghrelin, or what's called GRP2 or GRP6 peptide, in tandem with Sermorelin, long story short, you can inject a couple substances that get your pituitary gland to consistently squirt out more growth hormone. In the patients that have done this in our clinic, you see maybe a 50% or more increase in IGF-1 levels if you get them in a first morning blood draw. So there are novel, interesting, cheaper than growth hormone ways to coax your brain into making more growth hormone, clinically validated. They seem to work. And you generally know something is working in the growth hormone department if you're sleeping better. I would say that's the first indication. If your skin feels tighter, or your metabolism increasing, or you're getting better experience with performance, with endurance, and those types of things, then yes, maybe this is helping in that regard too. And that's the reason I think a lot of ultra athletes are interested in growth hormone, right? Because there's this whole idea, hey, I'm tearing up my body, I'm ultra running, or I'm weight training, and I'm just shredding tissue, and boy, wouldn't it be great if I could just grow and repair tissue like nobody's business, because that's going to help me perform better, which is why growth hormone, human growth hormone, is a performance enhancing drug, right? So is performance enhancement, going to the beginning of our conversation, necessarily the best approach for longevity management or anti-aging? I don't know, but what seems interesting is that, what does growth hormone do? You inject growth hormone into your body every single day, day after day after day, and you're using super physiological amounts, or more than your body would make. You're stimulating cells to grow and divide as you're stimulating these growth and repair processes. The theoretical implication of ramping up growth and division more than your body would do is unmitigated and uncontrolled cellular division, which sounds a lot like
cancer.
Exactly. So that's why growth hormone is tightly regulated, and a lot of people freak out about growth hormone. And probably people should be cautious about how they use products that increase lots of growth hormone. In fact, there are multiple studies showing high IGF-1 is associated with cancer. So why are we trying to jack up IGF-1? But then again, why is that person's body making IGF-1? Maybe it has to do with some metabolic disturbance, and taking it exogenously doesn't necessarily fuel those same processes. So again, it's one of these areas of medicine that's quite complicated. What happens in a petri dish or in a theoretical environment does not necessarily translate in clinical research. One example of that, kids who have stunted growth because of pituitary tumors. For quality of life reasons, we give them growth hormones so they don't end up with short stature.
Right.
What would you think would happen if you give a bunch of young kids tons of growth hormone? That they might get
cancer over time, yeah.
They might get cancer. Or it might worsen the neoplasm they already have in their brain.
Yeah.
Turns out that doesn't happen. So we do have some evidence that giving growth hormone, at least to kids in the context of brain neoplasms and so forth, does not contribute to acceleration or progression or somehow change the course of their cancer.
Yeah, but to run with that story a little further, if we know that cancer is kind of a disease of aging, right? So maybe the telomeres are shorter, there's a lot more turnover and inflammation or whatnot going on. So I hear what you're saying, and I believe that as well. But is that the best subpopulation to look at potentially, right? And so all that being said, clinically, you're a clinician, right? You've been using GHRP6 and Sermorelin in a few patients over years. What are some of the improvements that you see, and then maybe some of the negative side effects?
Yeah, so it's some of those things I said, better workout performance recovery, definitely improvements in sleep. And then clearly their IGF-1 levels are increasing sort of proportional to the dose that they're taking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's so much carryover associated with improvements in sleep. So that in and of itself, if that's all it did, would be amazing, right?
It would be amazing. And let's also think about growth and repair. So let's say you tore your Achilles tendon and you were having a treatment to fix that tendon, like a regenerative treatment, like stem cells or PRP. And you were invested in this idea of accelerating growth and repair processes for a short period of time. Well, then these substances could have a novel application in the space of regenerative medicine for short-term accelerated healing, and then, drop back off of them and go back into your normal homeostatic state.
So as you said, kind of like pulsatile them in the context, right? So like post-surgical repair, things of that sort, right?
Yep.
So chronic, if someone just comes to you like, Jeff, I just want to look like I did in my 20s. Yeah. Are you going to advise them to go on GHRP6 and Sermorelin? Okay.
No, I'm not going to be that sort of vanguard with the use of it, and nor do I think necessarily that's going to be the holy grail for reversing aging. I feel fairly strongly that growth hormone is one of those tools in the anti-aging toolkit, but it's unfortunately one of those tools that's very glitzy and glossy and overhyped. And I think you would agree with this too, Mike, but basically everybody wants that fancy shiny object and pill to take to, look 20 and feel 20 and maybe have the telomeres of a 20-year-old. But the reality is there's never going to be a substitute for healthy eating, lots of plant material, sunshine, water, adequate sleep, stress management, positive loving relationships, feeling connected to your community. That's what promotes the health of this organism. So if you have a patient who's not doing any of those things and they want to take testosterone and growth hormone, and we see some people like that, I try to set them straight and say, hey, you really got to invest in the stuff that actually makes you healthy. Because a couch potato can inject testosterone or take growth hormone. Is it going to do anything? Probably not.
Right. Yeah, really good point. And in that individual, it might cause even more harm than good, like we're talking
Potentially.
about, right? And so it's the healthy people that are doing everything else that may need that extra edge or want the extra edge for short term, then we're talking about improving health, not maybe exacerbating some underlying disease.
Right, and if you overdo it, everybody thinks more is better, but if you have too much growth hormone, you get paresthesias, you get high blood glucose, you get all kinds of health problems.
Really good stuff. So do you ever recommend just straight up growth hormone in your practice?
So rarely, but I have had a couple patients, and that is done with me working in concert with endocrinology. So if I have a patient that has all the symptoms, classic symptoms of growth hormone deficiency, we want to get a stimulation test. So you can do arginine stimulation test or insulin stimulation test. There are various stimulation tests, and if they fail those tests, they're candidates for growth hormone. We've also had patients who have traumatic brain injury, and I have some ex-football player patients that have very low levels of growth hormone, and they have other abnormalities of their pituitary endocrine system. And we've been able to get those people worked up through endocrinology, and they're on growth hormone now and maybe a little bit of thyroid and maybe testosterone because they have serious access dysfunction. There are some clinics that are thinking more progressive in this domain, and they're thinking that really anybody with head trauma probably needs growth hormone to repair the brain. Not forever, but if you get them in during the acute states of brain inflammation, things like progesterone and growth hormone would be fantastic for an injured brain. And there is some clinical research on that, and there are some, I know of a clinic in LA, for example, that utilizes those treatments with real growth hormone, but prescribing real growth hormone has two major challenges. Number one, it's incredibly expensive. It's $700 a month approximately. And number two, there are immense regulatory hurdles to prescribing it for anything other than 4 approved indications.
And what's up with that regulation? What's the backstory?
I think it's well, first of all, it's one of these performance enhancing drugs. It's a controlled substance. It's a drug that has a high potential for abuse. But probably the main issue is that if you sprinkle growth hormone on any cancer in a petri dish, you get more cancer. And that seems to freak everybody out. And I think what we're lacking is large clinical controlled trials where you gave a bunch of people no growth hormone and a bunch of people a bunch of growth hormone and you followed them for 10 years. I think even that study is probably considered unethical because there's such a high concern for cancer. So we may never know in a large clinical placebo double-blind controlled study if growth hormone is safe or not.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's a challenge.
That is, yeah, especially for, people that have had trauma, like brain trauma, like you mentioned. So we caught up with Fred Grover, I think episode number 60 some on, and he said the counter-coup of the head trauma can affect the whole HPA axis. So going back to like football players and people that have been in high impact type sports for a while, they can have hormonal dysregulation just from banging their head.
Right, and they might do a brain scan, might CT or MR their brain. But who's looking at their TSH and their ACTH and their LH and their FSH and their testosterone and their estradiol and their prolactin and all those things and their growth hormone and IGF-1? Nobody. But you're correct. I mean, that inflammation in the brain seems to affect the hypothalamic pituitary axis. And what else might kind of not counter-coup the brain, but cause a stress centrally to the brain? Sleep apnea. That may be one of the reasons we see low testosterone in sleep apnea patients because their hypothalamus is messed up because they're not oxygenating their brain at night.
Love that. So mouth taping, have you gotten into that yet or recommend that?
I have. Is that when you record yourself?
Or like literally taping your mouth shut at night to prevent the sleep disorder breathing, kind of precursor to sleep apnea.
I have not really heard of or recommended that, but I like the idea.
Yeah, that's cool. We'll put the links to that, another video, and I'll give you the video on that. So Jeff, you were on episode number 35. So we already asked you these kind of final questions here, but that was like 3.5 years ago.
What episode are we on today? It's like
we're
200 or something?
It's going to be close to 200, yeah.
Awesome.
So thanks for hanging in there with us.
Yeah, no, we love these conversations, and man, the stuff that you've been exposed to out there is awesome. So thanks for doing all that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Love it. All right, so let's talk about your morning routine.
Okay.
So if there's, I know you're a busy guy, you're seeing a lot of patients here at Restore PDX. What's your ideal morning routine, and maybe what do you tell your patients to do every day to really start the day off? Like you mentioned, not just eating well and all that, but meaning and purpose and having a sense of community and loving relationships. Yeah. What does your morning look like?
So let me tell you what I do, and it fluctuates, but my current routine, I happen to be on a good path at the moment, and I'm like anyone else, you fall off the wagon from time to time. My current morning routine, I get up at 5:15, I do Ashtanga yoga for 40 minutes, I make some oolong tea, I prep my smoothie. So at work I have a Vitamix base, but I have a couple extra carafes. So I prep my carafe, which currently, and this is always changing, but currently I have a 4-mushroom superfood blend. I put in some fresh turmeric root and ginger. Usually there's half an apple, maybe half a banana, some frozen blueberries, and usually a protein powder. Currently I'm actually using Zymogen's OptiCleanse GHI in my smoothie. So that's, and sometimes I'll add in flaxseed or flaxseed oil or even fresh olive oil if I've got it. And then the base is usually water. So I mix all that up, but I don't blend it. I take it to work. I usually go a few hours, so I'll see my first couple patients, and usually somewhere between 9 and 10, I'm getting pretty hungry, blend my smoothie. So that's my breakfast.
Love it.
And then I go throughout the day. So the yoga is kind of helping me with the sort of stress management, exercise, flexibility, mobility piece. I'm doing a lot of deep breathing with that Ashtanga. And then I've got, at least I know my breakfast is awesome. So I know we all, falter, have snacks, or maybe we have, a beer or a glass of wine or something like that. But one of the things I've really tried to coach my patients through is this concept. If you make your breakfast a superfood powerhouse, and you even forget about what you eat the rest of the day, you've just made 33% of your diet 100% perfect.
Beautiful.
So I start there, and then with our patients, we start thinking about lunch, we start thinking about dinner. We use things like Mark Hyman's book, Eat Fat, Get Thin. We use general concepts that we all know in functional medicine, less refined carbohydrates, more vegetables. I'm a big fan of focusing on vegetables. I think the jury will never be out on this idea. Half your plate of food, colorful, fresh, raw vegetables, or good quality vegetables. Where there's a little bit of back and forth, I think always is what goes on the other half of your plate. Is it 25% fat and 25% protein? Is it 90% fat? Is it, we seem to be tweaking that, but I think where everybody agrees in this functional medicine diet nutritional space is we need crap loads of fresh, colorful produce. You know?
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
I agree 100%. And
Yeah.
I could tell that you make turmeric raw. I wanted to ask you can't see it on camera, guys, but your fingertips are a little bit orange. So
Look at that.
I was gonna ask you if you cook with turmeric, because that's like the dead giveaway. Because
Yeah.
I would say the only downside to using fresh turmeric, like we talked about, you put it in your smoothie, is it does get on your hands and it stains.
We're like a cult. It's like the sign of the beast, you know? We got all these
Do a little handshake.
anti-aging guys walking around with the yellow fingers. We're like, oh,
I swear
that
I
guy's
don't
into
smoke.
alternative medicine.
Yeah. Oh, I love it, Jeff. Now, okay, so the yoga is by yourself or with your wife, or do you go to a studio?
I do it by myself. So I learned a sequence of postures, and then I just follow that sequence. But when I can pick up a class, I do. And Ashtanga is fairly rigorous, so that's my primary form of exercise at the moment is Ashtanga yoga. Ashtanga was developed thousands of years ago as a system to keep the body physically strong and healthy through the lifespan, so that you could meditate for long hours and never get disease.
So do you meditate?
Historically, yes. Currently, no.
Okay.
But it is one of those things I love. I have a lot of experience in the past. I spent many months in India in my early 20s, and just got to work it in, you know?
Yeah, it's hard juggling all these different things. But with the yoga, I mean, that is a form of meditation. I mean, you're getting partway there. Yeah.
Yeah, meditation really just translates to concentration. So anything you're concentratedly engaged in where your mind is not running amok, you could call that meditation.
And what form of meditation do you recommend, and what have you had the best feedback with?
Yeah, so I think the best science currently is on mindfulness meditation. I learned a slightly different practice when I was younger, but I really think it's hard to say because there's so many different styles and blends. I'd hate to say one form is better than another, but certainly the scientific research seems heavily weighted on mindfulness meditation. The nice thing about that is that's an easy form to work into a modern busy lifestyle because it requires 10 to 20 minutes a day.
Right. So the mantra base, the Vedic and transcendental, you're not really a fan of, or just have?
I would just say I would defer a strong opinion. I think it's all good.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, just get it done whenever you can.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Nor am I an expert in that, so I would defer to people who study multiple forms of meditation.
Right. And the key is you're going back to like testing the telomeres to see if the diet works for you. What does work for you to reduce your stress and keep the monkey mind at bay, right? So it may be...
Yeah, I think it's these things, sleep is critically important. I think, nighttime hygiene is really important. On nights where I'm doing emails or on my computer too late, I definitely don't sleep as well.
Yeah.
If I drink, if you drink wine too close to bedtime, it affects your growth hormone and it affects your deep wave sleep pattern. So if there's a night where I have a glass of wine too close to bedtime, for example, I don't sleep as well. So I think nighttime routine is very important. I think sleep hygiene should be taken very seriously. I think nighttime routines where 2 to 3 hours before sleep, you start to wind down. On nights that I do that, I'm definitely sleeping better. If you sleep better, you wake up refreshed, better rested. So I think throughout the day, it's also important I take an hour lunch break. So I get out of the clinic. I usually go to Whole Foods and hit the salad bar, relax. I work 4 days a week, so on my weekends, I'm doing pleasurable activities with my family, which speaks to the whole, people who are married live longer, people with kids seem to live longer for some reason, but it has to do with that, I think, social engagement and positive, loving relationship aspect of longevity.
Beautiful. Love it.
Yeah.
All right, so let's transition a little bit to a favorite herb, nutrient, or botanical, or maybe it's a food substance in this case. But Jeff, you're stranded on a desert island.
Yeah.
Omega-3s, vitamin D are covered.
Yeah.
What's coming with you and why?
You're going to love this answer, and it may not be an answer that a lot of people say on your show, but green tea.
You had some before the show.
I did. I've been drinking pu'er tea all day today,
Nice.
which is a kind of aged green tea. But again, I'm kind of into research. So if you look at a single nutrient or food intervention that has some of the best data on it to reduce the physical signs and symptoms of aging and the genesis of chronic disease, I would challenge anybody to find depth of study greater than the studies on green tea. Let me give you an idea of some of the epidemiologic data on green tea. I mean, we now have studies on men and women in Japan who drink green tea, and they have followed these people now for 25 years. And they have followed, in just a single study I can reference, 100,000 people. So imagine a study where you follow 100,000 people's lifestyle habits for 25 years, and you stratify them to water drinkers, black tea drinkers, coffee drinkers, or green tea drinkers, and you control for all possible variables. And then you discover that the green tea drinkers had massive differences compared to those three other groups of beverage drinkers in all parameters of aging. So in some instances, a 30% reduction in the 4 or 5 major diseases that manifest with age. So if I told you, Mike, there's a supplement you can take that reduces your risk of any major chronic disease by 30%,
Everyone would take it.
you'd be like, that sounds pretty cool. And then I
Yeah.
said, and by the way, there's data with hundreds of thousands of people from places like Taiwan, China, and Japan corroborating this. It's fascinating. And of course, we know people who drink green tea live longer. There are cultures in Okinawa that have a high proportion of centenarians. And this is simple. So beverages, right? What do you drink? How interesting is it that swapping out one thing you drink for another could have such a massive implication in how long you live and how quickly you develop chronic disease? Why is that? I'll just briefly touch on this. Green tea turns out to be loaded with flavonols like catechins. It's high in polyphenols. It's loaded with things like theanine that help your brain. It's even got GABA, I learned recently. And what's interesting about, anyway, it gets even more off topic, but GABA hits certain receptors in your brain that are very interesting, that are not what you think, I learned recently. But anyway, green tea has all these amazing substances in concert. And other beverages that have caffeine just don't have that same volume of polyphenols and flavonols. And if you look at the antioxidants of green tea compared to coffee, for instance, coffee has some health benefits. But if you compare coffee and green tea, forget about it.
It's blown away.
It's just forget about it. Yes, there's a nice study, a couple studies on liver disease in coffee drinkers and heart disease in coffee drinkers, but there's thousands and thousands of studies on green tea and everything you can imagine.
I love it. So how long do you steep it for? Any tips like for practical?
Yeah, so this gets kind of complicated, but my favorite way to steep tea now is called Gong Fu style, and I encourage people to look this up online, Gong space Fu. Gong Fu is a quick flash brewing, so you can take a high quality loose leaf green tea or pu'er or oolong tea, and you brew it basically for like 30 seconds at a time with really hot water, but you can brew it 9 times.
Oh, wow.
And you get much more complex flavor that way, and you end up extracting all the possible goodies out of that plant. If you brew regular green tea for like 4 or 5 minutes, it just gets bitter, and you don't get quite the same amount of extraction as if you do it Gong Fu style, which is the kind of the old school Chinese way of brewing tea, if you do like tea ceremony. But it's pretty easy to do if you have the right type of tea decanter. You just hot water, kind of strain it, enjoy it, do it again, do it again, do it again. And with high quality tea, you can do this 10 to 15 times.
Oh my gosh. Can you save it for the next day, or is it
You can.
Oh,
and
wow.
You can, and there's some great YouTube videos on tea fanatics doing this. But yeah, if you just, say you brewed it twice, you could throw it in the fridge in a Tupperware container and then pull it out the next day and start brewing it your other 7 times.
That's awesome. So you can, because green tea is not inexpensive if you get the organic, really good stuff. So
the stuff I've been buying is quite expensive, but yeah, get the most out of your high quality. And a high quality green tea should be, hand picked, hand processed. Higher mountain tea is good, and tea tree plants that are older are in Chinese thought to have more cha qi, which means they have more of that qi because the roots. Some of these trees are 1,000 years old, so their roots are crazy deep in the earth. They're getting all that mineral extraction, all that vital kind of chi energy. So yeah, you can go nuts with tea. It's once you dive into tea,
it's like
it's
wine
its
at some
own.
level.
It's like wine. It's like its own universe.
Yeah, pretty amazing. Yeah, I mean, we hear a lot about the old vine wine grapes and things like that. So it sounds kind of the same.
Yeah,
Pretty
complexity of flavor and probably health benefits as well.
Love it. Awesome, Jeff. Really good. These are awesome tips. People are going to dig this. So the final kind of question here, if you were to bump shoulders with a politician in an elevator of sorts, maybe from the US or Canada or abroad, what sort of lifestyle or health tip would you want them to know that maybe they can influence some sort of policy around to really improve the health of the masses?
Yeah, I think I think other people have said this on your show, but obviously something to do with diet and the culture and incentivizing food subsidies or food programs that promote organic, sustainable farming. I mean, ultimately what we need in the United States is more availability of cheap, locally produced, nutrient-rich food that's medicine. But what's the population that's affected currently most by crappy food? Kids. So, and I think kids speak to people's heart more, and maybe you could get some legislative, heartstrings pulled if you did this, but something that massively improves the nutritional value of the food that children are eating and incentivizes growing and producing those foods locally for those kids.
Love it.
I think
and there's a
that
lot
would
of that
be
going on here
awesome.
in Portland, yeah?
Yeah, so Portland has a movement like that. Jamie Oliver was one of those big proponents. When I was living and studying in New York, there was a roommate of mine worked at a Quaker school that they got most of their food from local farms. and actually went there and interviewed them. It was awesome. So
That's really cool.
the movement is kind of happening, but parents want their kids to eat good food. They want them to develop good habits. You start young, you don't develop diabetes. I mean, you've seen this walking around, a 22-year-old patient 2 weeks ago with diabetes and fatty liver disease. This stuff's happening. It's insane. And it's because of multi-generational consumption of food that's poison versus food that's medicine. And it can sometimes take 2 or 3 generations to reverse that.
Scary.
That's what they see in the animal models.
Yeah.
You know, you feed mice the wrong thing after a few generations, you got onset of diabetes much faster, but then it can take a few generations to reverse. So we have multi-generational work to do, and that's daunting, but that's what will heal us.
Beautifully said. Jeff, if folks want to connect with you online, I know you do a lot of videos at Restore PDX. You see patients there. What's the best online resource?
Perfect. So our clinic is restorepdx.com. They can certainly go there, and that's what I would recommend, restorepdx.com.
And PDX.
We have a Facebook page as well, which I think is Restore PDX. PDX is the sort of local acronym for Portland, which is the one the Portland Airport uses, but anything PDX in Portland just means a business in Portland.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, it's really cool. I just want to throw that caveat if people aren't familiar with that.
Yeah.
Jeff, really appreciate you coming on the show.
Awesome.
This was awesome, guys. If you enjoyed this content, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. If you have a question for me or Jeff, please type it in the comment bar below, and I'll put all the associated links in the YouTube description. Thanks for tuning in, guys, and we'll catch up with you soon.